Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. You were never supposed to see this, but since you have, you might as well wear it. From the vaults of the shadows, a new collection of unsettling apparel and artifacts pulled straight from the stories that were never meant to surface. Soft, worn-in shirts and hoodies that feel like something you dug out of a locked trunk in an abandoned ranger station. This isn't just merch, it's evidence. The Warden of Cold Ridge, Chapter 1, Descent into the Hollow. The road ended 3 miles before the coordinates said it should. Dr. Lynn Harvorson stood beside her government-issued SUV, its tires half-sunken in a slurry of thawing permafrost and last year's needles, staring into a thicket of black spruce that clawed at the grey sky. This was the border of the Cold Ridge Exclusion Zone, a 5.4 square mile patch of glacial woodland nestled against the northern slopes of the Denali Basin. On paper, the land was protected for ecological study. In truth, no one came out here unless they were told to, and even then, they came alone. Lynn rolled her aching shoulders beneath her canvas-field jacket. 3 weeks prior, a satellite bot flagged a growth anomaly in Cold Ridge, rings of accelerated decay radiating outward from a single, unmappable point. The pattern didn't match disease, it didn't match frost, and most worryingly, it didn't match any prior data. She'd been tapped on the shoulder by the Department of Environmental Oversight. Quietly, a favor called in by an old mentor she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Bring soil probes, deep core samplers, and a drone, the email had read. You're not going to like what you find, but you'll understand why we chose you. She wasn't told why no team was assigned. She asked once. The only answer she received was a scanned report from 1987. 3 field researchers had gone missing inside the ridge. When they returned 5 days later, they were barefoot, mute, and had moss growing beneath their eyelids. 2 died within the week. The 3rd wandered into a bog and disappeared entirely. No one had gone back since. By dusk, Lynn had set up base camp a few hundred yards into the tree line. The air here had a muted pressure to it, like sound didn't carry quite right. Not a single bird call, no rustle of chipmunks. Just the wind hissing through needles and the dry groan of trunks twisting against each other. The pines were wrong. Not in any obvious way, not at first. But as she walked the perimeter, her boots crunching through brittle fernfall and shelf fungus, she noticed inconsistencies. Trees grew in tight, spiral formations, a natural impossibility. The same gnarled cedar appeared 3 times in different parts of the trail. Same scars, same knots, like a repeating texture in a glitched rendering. Lichen grew in thick mats around the bases of trees, but avoided the trunks entirely. She reached the first anomaly near twilight, a circle of absolute stillness, roughly 20 feet in diameter. All plant life inside it was yellowed and brittle. The edges were abrupt, sharp enough to trace with a compass. Even the snow was thinner here, like something had leached the ground's memory of water. Lynn crouched and scooped a soil sample. It crumbled dry in her palm, sterile. She plucked a blade of dead grass and turned it between her fingers. It detached whole from the soil, not uprooted, but set there. No roots, no decay, as if it had been placed for show. Her scalp prickled beneath her wool cap. She hadn't felt watched in years. Now she felt catalogued. The first night in the tent was worse. She lay on her cot with the zipper cracked to vent her breath, listening to the strange hush of the woods. Her wind meter had stopped spinning hours ago, even though the trees outside shifted in rhythmic patterns like something large was passing through them. But the movement never reached her. It circled instead. Slowly. She tried recording it. Her mic caught only static. When she finally drifted to sleep, she dreamed of hands buried in soil. Not clawing out, just resting there, palms up, fingers slack, as if offering something. Bark grew from the wrists. Eyes opened along the fingers. She woke to the scent of wet moss, inside her tent. The next morning, she found footprints around the circle. Not boots, bare feet, leading out of the dead ring and vanishing into a wall of birch that hadn't been there yesterday. Later that day, she went into town to ask questions. The locals didn't answer them. In the diner, she was met with stares, fork-scraping silence, and eventually a woman in her 60s who approached without smiling. She sat across from Lynn without asking. "You're staying up there?" the woman asked, voice low and even. "I'm just conducting ecological research, sampling the ridge decay." The woman's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Lynn folded her arms. "Do you know what's causing it?" "No," the woman said, "but I know why it's shaped like that." She slid a paper napkin across the table and drew a spiral. "It moves in circles. It watches from the center, and when the circle closes, someone disappears. That's the pattern." Lynn looked down at the spiral. "What is it?" The woman tapped the center with a cracked nail. "The Warden." Chapter 2. Circles without center. The trail back into Cold Ridge was shorter than she remembered. Lynn checked her GPS twice as she hiked in. The coordinates stayed steady, but her compass needle began to drift the farther she walked. North jittered, flicking a few degrees left, then right, like it was unsure of itself. She chalked it up to magnetic interference, maybe iron in the soil, and pressed on. But there was a deeper wrongness beneath the scientific excuses. A slant to the air, a geometry that didn't hold. The same birch tree passed her 4 times. Not similar trees, the same one. Split trunk, healed lightning scar, and a rusted nail half driven into its bark, as if someone had once tried to hang a warning sign and then thought better of it. Her boots hit a spot of marshy ground that squelched exactly as it had 20 minutes before. A rotten log with white lichen resembled a dog's yawning skull from one angle. The terrain was cycling. It was an unnatural loop, a spiral with no true center, like the decay rings in the satellite photos. Lynn had been a botanist long enough to know that plants didn't grow in radial formations like this unless something was repelling them. Not a disease, not frost. Something older, something invisible, and something very much alive. Her tent had moved. When she broke back through the tree line into the clearing, she found her camp 50 yards to the east of where she left it, positioned just outside the perimeter of the first dead ring. The soil sample flags she'd left the night before were missing. In their place, neat rows of pine cones, all opened, all facing the same direction, toward the ridge. She knelt by them, heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped animal. They weren't there by chance. She hadn't left them. The cones weren't from any of the pines she'd sampled. These were from an alpine species that didn't grow anywhere near the ridge. She stood up too fast and nearly fell over. Her hands were shaking. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the first taste of being out of place, and something else had taken her place. Later, she reviewed the drone footage. Her thermal drone, nicknamed Hestia, had flown a tight grid over the decay zone while she was gone. As expected, the vegetation in the central rings was heatless, inert. But something flickered in frame 418, a single still image from 2:23 a.m., a tall shape near her tent. Upright, unmoving. No thermal signature. She flipped forward. Frame 419, empty. Frame 420, still empty. No retreat, no motion, just one frame of silent presence. She stared at the image, fingers hovering over the trackpad, the pressure in her chest rising like a tide. The figure was half obscured by the trees, but its posture was unmistakable. It was leaning forward, reaching. She hadn't heard a thing. That night, her dreams returned, but they no longer belonged to her. She dreamt of rows of bodies laid beneath roots, not buried, but cultivated. Limbs bound in vines. Faces turned up toward the soil above, waiting. Their mouths were packed with bark, mulch, and ants. Lichen grew from their open eyes, branching like veins. Above them, the trees whispered with dry, insect-chittering voices, repeating her name in brittle syllables. "Lion, lion, lion." She woke to the sound of buzzing inside her ears. There were no insects in the tent, but her journal had been opened, and on the last page, a sketch. Her own hand, her pen, a spiral ringed with what looked like roots, and beneath it a single sentence, written in shaky, unfocused script. "The Warden saw me today." She hadn't written it, or she didn't remember writing it. By morning, even the birds avoided Cold Ridge. She was sure of it now, and though she couldn't explain why, she left her boots outside the tent before going to sleep. She wouldn't realize until days later. The bodies in the old report had been found barefoot, moss in their eyes. Chapter 3, Root Logic. She woke to silence. Not just the absence of birdsong, but a kind of vacuum, the stillness after a scream in a sealed room. Even the wind had abandoned Cold Ridge. Lynn sat up slowly, blinking in the dim grey morning. The sky above her tent flap was overcast, same as the day before, same as every day since she arrived. But something was wrong with the light. It fell slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that didn't point in the right direction. She stepped out into the clearing. Her boots were exactly where she left them, toes pointed toward the trees. But there were footprints around them, bare white-toed, not hers. They circled the boots 3 times and then vanished into the brush. She didn't follow them. Instead, she grabbed her mapping gear, slung her satchel over one shoulder, and started the day's task with gritted determination. The deeper she went, the more necessary the work became, as if by naming this thing, by charting it, she could contain it. That was the logic of science. That was the logic that had kept her sane for 37 years. But Cold Ridge did not abide logic. It bent it. She set down new sample flags and began marking the outermost ring again. GPS was no help. The coordinates stuttered and reset, placing her tent both east and west of her current location. She turned to hand sketching in her notebook, drawing the shapes from memory and from sight. Each ring was concentric, perfectly spaced, but no two had the same thickness. Some bulged, some warped inward like they were recoiling. It took her a full hour to notice the pattern. The rings were not circles, they were veins. She laid the map down on a fallen log and stared at it. The spacing, the branching, the sudden swell of one ring into another, it mirrored the vascular structure of a leaf or a brain. It wasn't natural, not completely, but it wasn't chaos either. Something was designing this, something intelligent enough to mimic biological systems or to rewrite them, and the shapes weren't just spreading out. They were folding inward, toward a single point. Her pencil tip snapped. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been gripping it. The break startled her, and she looked up to catch her breath, and that's when she saw it again, between 2 cedars on the ridgeline. The figure, still as bark, thin as a dead limb. It stood facing her, too far to see clearly, but unmistakable in its posture, head tilted slightly to one side, arms hanging low, almost brushing the moss. Its elbows bent backwards. She blinked. It was gone. The cedars swayed slightly, as if something had passed through them. That night, she found a new drawing in her field notebook. It wasn't hers. The lines were too jagged, too deep pressed into the paper, like they'd been carved in haste. The image was a tangle of roots, not underground, but above, suspended in air, reaching downward like veins from an unseen body. At their center, a circle with a dot in the middle, the same shape she'd mapped earlier that day. And below it, written in that same shaky hand, "You are not lost. You are planted." The next morning, a branch had been placed across her tent flap, balanced deliberately, forked at one end like a crooked finger. She hadn't heard anyone or anything in the night, but her boots had been turned again, this time away from the woods, as if something wanted her to leave, or worse, as if it was warning her that she still could, because once the center is found, there's no way back. Chapter 4, Echo Timber. The forest was no longer silent, but it wasn't alive in any way Lynn recognized. It was something else entirely. She first heard the clicks just after dawn, tiny, rhythmic, almost like Morse code, but slower, deliberate. She paused her sample collection, tilting her head, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound came from the trees themselves, or rather, the insects swarming their bark. She crouched beside a gnarled cedar and watched as dozens of small beetle-like creatures moved with unnatural precision, tapping their mandibles against the rough bark in perfect unison. The cadence was not random, it repeated, almost like a message. Lynn tried to record the sound with her handheld device, but playback was distorted. The clicks modulated strangely, interspersed with a faint undertone, an almost imperceptible whisper beneath the tapping. She wiped sweat from her brow and turned toward her trail cameras, curious if they'd caught anything unusual overnight. The footage chilled her more than the clicks. The insects weren't just tapping. They were moving in patterns, forming shapes against the tree trunks. Sometimes, the shifting masses of beetles took on the vague outline of a human figure, mirroring her posture as she moved. One clip showed her standing still, looking down at the forest floor, and the beetles on the nearest tree rearranging themselves into a rough approximation of her own silhouette, arms hanging awkwardly at the sides. A shiver ran down her spine. The forest is watching, and it's learning. That evening, as she sat hunched over her notes by the dying fire, she caught herself pausing mid-sentence, hearing faint whispers among the crackling flames. The voices were too soft to distinguish, but they echoed her own thoughts, half-formed doubts, memories she hadn't spoken aloud. Her heart pounded as the forest seemed to press in around her. In her tent, shadows shifted unnaturally. Branches scratched softly against the canvas, but not with the randomness of wind, more like tentative fingers testing her resolve. She barely slept. When dawn broke, Lynn found another unsettling change. Her boots, always by the tent flap, were missing. In their place lay a perfectly arranged circle of brittle twigs, each one bent at a right angle, forming a spidery web. In the center rested a single, decayed leaf, blackened and brittle, but unmistakably shaped like an eye. It felt like a warning, or a message: "You are seen." Her own handwriting scrawled along the bottom of her journal page, one word repeated over and over, as if inscribed by an invisible hand. Mira. Chapter 5. The Warden appears. The sun dipped low behind the glacial ridge, casting long fingers of shadow through the skeletal trees. The forest had grown colder, sharper, as if the very air was drawing tighter around Lynn's lungs. Her trail cameras, which until now had only captured still, motionless images, began to record movement, but not the fluid, natural motion she expected. Instead, the figure in the footage appeared unnervingly stiff, every step halted and jerky, like a puppet's limbs caught mid-pull. In one chilling frame, the figure was closer than ever, a towering silhouette with angular limbs bent at unnatural joints. It reached out toward what should have been her tent, fingers long and twig-like, tipped with brittle bark. That night, Lynn sat frozen in her tent, barely daring to breathe. She could feel it nearby. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of watching. Her dreams shattered what little peace she had left. She found herself trapped in a cavern of roots and earth, her skin merging with moss and bark. Her mouth was dry, sealed with rough strips of lichen, suffocating her words before they could form. Branches grew inside her throat, choking off air and sound. She woke gasping, sweat cold on her skin, hands shaking uncontrollably. Her journal was no refuge. When she opened it, she found pages rewritten in a strange script, branching lines like twisted vines curling across the paper. The letters seemed alive, crawling and rearranging themselves under her gaze. Desperation set in. She began leaving small offerings around her camp, smooth stones stacked in spirals, fresh water poured over moss, careful carvings etched into bark. Yet nothing seemed to soothe whatever watched her. One evening, drawn by a faint, almost musical creak, Lynn stepped outside her tent. The figure stood there, no longer obscured by shadows. The Warden was tall, far taller than any human, its body a patchwork of decaying wood and insect carapace. Limbs bent in unsettling angles, segments clicking softly like brittle exoskeletons. Its face was a mask of bark and fungus, with dark hollows where eyes might have been. But it did not move toward her. It only watched. And in that moment, Lynn understood. The Warden did not hunt. It waited. Chapter 6. The lingering watch of the days blurred into one another beneath the towering pines of Cold Ridge. Time became slippery, hours stretching endlessly, then snapping forward without warning. Lynn's journal entries grew more fragmented, the handwriting shaky, uneven, as though her mind itself was fracturing beneath the weight of the forest's gaze. She no longer trusted the quiet. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig reverberated like a whispered warning. The natural sounds of the forest had twisted into something else, something foreign, alien. The insects hummed with a strange cadence, like an insect choir in dissonant harmony, their buzzing weaving through the branches in haunting patterns. Each morning, she woke to find the camp subtly altered. Rocks she'd stacked in careful spirals knocked askew, her equipment shifted a few inches. footprints too large and too thin pressed into the mossy earth nearby, footprints that weren't hers. Her sleep was invaded by recurring nightmares. She stood in the heart of the ridge's dead zone, surrounded by perfect rings of lifeless trees. A towering figure loomed, its limbs slowly unraveling like brittle branches, skin peeling away to reveal a mesh of fungus and insect shell beneath. It extended a hand, twisted and jointed, and whispered a name that was hers but not quite. A warped echo, a shadow of her own identity. The forest wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting for something. Driven by a need she could barely explain, Lynn began exploring deeper into the glacial ridge's core, beyond where her maps ended, and even the locals dared to tread. The air grew colder still, thick with the scent of decay and earth turned to rot. Moss blanketed the ground in thick, velvet cushions, but beneath it was a soft, sickly squelch, as if the earth itself breathed beneath her boots. The dead trees grew taller and stranger here. Bark cracked open in irregular patterns, revealing smooth, segmented limbs like the carapace of some immense insect. Their branches arced overhead in twisted arches, forming a cathedral of unnatural wood and shadow. Her skin prickled with a crawling sensation, as though unseen insects traced invisible paths along her arms and neck. Then she found the circle, a perfect ring of withered plants, their roots severed cleanly as if sliced by a surgical blade. The center was bare earth, dark and damp. She knelt, brushing soil aside to reveal something half-buried, an ancient, decayed root system that seemed to pulse faintly beneath her fingers. Suddenly, the hair on her neck stood on end. She turned. There it was again, the Warden, standing motionless, almost camouflaged against the mottled bark behind it, limbs bent at cruel angles. Its presence was suffocating, a weight pressing down on her chest. Lynn's voice trembled as she whispered, "What do you want?" The Warden's response was silence, but in the stillness, Lynn could swear the air itself hummed with unspoken words. She felt exposed, as if the forest was peeling away layers of her identity, her past mistakes, her regrets, her guilt. Every hidden corner laid bare beneath the watchful eyes of something ancient and unforgiving. That night, back in her tent, Lynn pored over her notes, desperate for answers. Her handwriting was barely legible, spiraling into indecipherable scrawls and branching symbols like those that had appeared earlier. A single, chilling phrase repeated itself at the bottom of one page, written in perfect clarity. "The Warden waits for those who linger." Sleep would not come easily again. Chapter 7, Roots That Remember by Morning. The branches outside Lynn's tent were arranged into a spiral. Not fallen, placed. Each twig angled toward her tent like compass needles. She stepped out slowly, her breath steaming in the chilled air. The entire clearing was silent. Even the insects had stopped. She scanned the tree line, heart racing, and then she saw it. Not the Warden this time, but something stranger, a tree that hadn't been there before. One that bowed inwards, its trunk arching like a skeletal neck. Lichen clung to its bark in shapes almost like script, and at its base, a depression in the earth that looked freshly opened, like something had either been buried there or climbed out. Lynn had the sense of having trespassed, not just physically, but spiritually, like she had stepped somewhere memory itself had tried to forget. Her radio no longer worked. She hadn't received any calls from base camp in 2 days. The solar batteries were drained more quickly than they should have been, as if the forest was feeding on her energy, leeching every connection she had to the outside world. Then came the scent, sweet, sickly, like rotting honey. She followed it deeper, camera in hand, into a patch of forest where the trees all leaned in the same direction, like mourners at a funeral. Their trunks twisted and brittle. The ground was soft, spongy. Every step she took sunk just slightly more than it should. She knelt and pushed aside a bed of soft moss. What lay beneath was not earth but bark, not from a tree, from skin. It was flesh, half transformed, lichen growing in place of paws, wood grain curling beneath cracked fingernails. It had once been a hand, human, her breath caught. She stumbled back, only to hear the faintest crackle behind her, a twig snapping. But when she turned, there was no one there, just the trees watching, and a thought buried itself in her like a tick. This place remembers every step. It does not forgive the ones who linger. Chapter 8. Among the still trees, Lynn didn't leave her tent that night. Instead, she sat cross-legged inside, headlamp flickering above her, staring at the trail cam photos she'd taken earlier that week. Each one showed the same thing. Shots of empty forest, shadows between trees, a strange distortion at the edge of one frame, but one image made her blood freeze. The figure, the Warden, was in it, just behind her, barely visible. Its shape jagged and thin, as though made of stitched bark and twine. Its limbs were in mid-motion, but blurred. One arm reached outward toward the camera, toward her. She flipped through again. It was there in more shots than she remembered. Some close, some impossibly close, as if standing just behind her shoulder, but never captured until she looked after. How long had it been near her? The next morning, her boots were missing. In their place was a pile of moss, wet, fresh, and imprinted in the center toes, human, bare, as though someone had stepped there moments before. But she had been alone, hadn't she? Lynn tried to leave, tried to pack her samples, her gear, mark a route back toward the ranger station. But the trail was gone. The trees had changed. Paths that once wound toward the ridge's edge now looped inwards. Trail markers she'd painted were missing. The GPS sputtered and froze, flickering between maps that didn't match. One displayed no location at all, just a static screen and a string of branching lines where coordinates should be, like roots, as if the forest was folding around her, drawing her inward. One night she dreamt she was underground, beneath the glacial ridge, beneath the roots, buried alive in a cocoon of fungus and bark. The Warden watched from above, not with eyes, but with something deeper, older, its presence a pressure in her skull. In the dream, it leaned down and whispered in a voice like crackling ice, "You are already beneath." She woke with dirt under her fingernails, and a single word scratched into the canvas wall of her tent. Witness. Chapter 9. The memory beneath the moss. Lynn no longer marked the days. There was no point. The sun still rose, but it felt like it did so out of obligation, not rhythm. The light barely filtered through the boughs anymore, and when it did, it made the shadows look thicker, like something oily and old was writhing just beneath the bark. Her journal entries had changed. The words weren't hers. She'd found pages she had no memory of writing, entire passages in that same branching, root-like script. Sometimes when she touched the page, her fingertips itched, and a scent like wet soil filled her nostrils. She stopped writing eventually. The journal kept writing without her. The Warden hadn't appeared again, not fully, but its absence had grown louder than its presence ever was. Lynn swore she saw it in the corner of her eye, always just behind a tree. A shiver that followed her down the spine of the trail. The unnatural way the wind stopped when she was about to turn around. The sound of breathing, never hers. She followed a trail of peeled bark one morning. Each strip hung from a branch like old, flayed skin. They led her to a thicket where the moss bulged oddly, as if something beneath the earth was breathing. She almost didn't dig, but she had to. She used her hands. The soil parted like old fabric, dry and soft and fibrous. The deeper she went, the less it felt like dirt, more like insulation. Organic insulation, fungal, pliable. And then she saw the shape, a boot, just the toe, peeking out. She scraped more away, and with it came cloth, a jacket sleeve. A collar, skin still intact, green-veined and speckled with moss. The eyes stared upward. Wide, glassy, the same uniform as hers. The ID tag read, Dr. L. Halvorsen. Lynn froze. There was no sound, no wind. Just the slow, creaking groan of a forest watching. It wasn't just a body. It was her, a perfect replication, or a memory. She didn't know. Had she already died here? Was the forest showing her a past or a future? Was it echoing her? She staggered back, heart slamming, dirt caked into her nails, shaking her head. It wasn't possible. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. But the body's mouth moved, just slightly, just enough. And something whispered up through the moss. "Stay," she screamed and ran. Didn't know where, didn't care. Branches tore at her coat, blood bloomed across her wrists, her legs. She ran until her lungs burned and her vision swam. And when she finally collapsed, she was back at her tent. But the tent was gone. Only the moss remained, smoothed over in a wide, perfect circle. And in the center, her pack, unzipped. Inside it, her journal, open to the last page, in her handwriting. It made me a part of it. Chapter 10. The roots are watching. Lynn woke with bark in her mouth. She gagged, hands clawing at her lips, pulling splinters free in wet, choking sobs. The taste was sharp and mineral, like old wood that had grown teeth. When her breath returned, she was no longer where she'd collapsed. She was inside something. A hollowed space beneath the glacial ridge, dim and root-bound, the ceiling barely high enough to crouch. The walls pulsed faintly, lined with rhizomes and gnarled tubers like a breathing lung made of wood. The air was warm, sweet, rot-sweet, and something was watching. Not from the dark, from within her. It had always been watching, since the moment she set foot on this land. Since the first sample pulled free from Earth that did not want to be disturbed. Since she heard that first silence between the trees, the kind that felt like a closed door. She wasn't alone down here. Roots coiled over shapes. Human ones, some skeletal, others not. All of them partially absorbed, faces smoothed by moss, hands stretched upward in frozen gestures, veins mapped with green like vines running underneath translucent skin. But they were not corpses. They were still being held. And in the far end of the chamber, kneeling upright in a position of false prayer, was the man from the trail cams, the other botanist, or what was left of him. Dr. O'Connell's face was intact but waxy, preserved in perfect detail. His eyes were open, but they didn't look at her. They didn't seem to look at anything at all. Roots extended from his body like feeding tubes. They pulsed with sap. Lynn reached for his satchel, still hanging on his side like it had been placed that way deliberately. Inside, a small waterproof field book. She flipped through the final pages with trembling hands. Most were stained, half-eaten by moisture, but the last few lines were legible. It doesn't consume, it integrates. It remembers everyone who enters. Each step echoes the guilt we bury. It wants witnesses, not escapees. It waits, because the forest doesn't hunt, it invites. Lynn sat still for a long time. She could feel the roots beneath her adjusting, listening. She thought of every moment she dismissed, the early warnings from townsfolk, the perfect symmetry of the dead rings, the unnatural arrangement of plants that shouldn't have grown in alpine soil. She had ignored it, interpreted the landscape as data, not voice. And in doing so, she'd consented, because the Warden wasn't a creature. It was the memory of the land, a record of intrusion, of consequence, a sentience grown from centuries of footprints left by people who saw the forest as inert. Lynn didn't scream. She sat quietly, listening, breathing, thinking of the people she'd stepped over to reach this career, the corners cut, the fragile spaces disturbed for progress. The silence that followed her had not been emptiness, it had been a question, and now she understood the answer. She reached for her own notebook and began to write. The last line. I think it wanted a witness. I think that was the mistake. And when she finished, she left the notebook on a raised patch of lichen, as if it had always been there. And then she stood, walked forward into the soft root light, and was taken, but not in the way people feared. She became part of it, and it in turn remembered her forever. Epilogue, static bloom. The rescue team never found her. They reached the coordinates left in Dr. Halvorson's last transmission, a patch of brittle brush on the edge of a barren slope, surrounded by dead ferns and animal bones that didn't belong to any known species. Her tent was there, half-packed, untouched. Inside, her sat phone switched off. Her journals, all of them, lay closed, stacked with unnatural precision. Each page had been overwritten in strange, fractal-like patterns, almost botanical in nature. The language wasn't decipherable, but it repeated motifs, branching, spirals, mirrored rings. The only human message left behind was a single sticky note pressed to the tent wall. Do not map what you are not willing to become. They searched for 3 days. Helicopters, dogs, drones, nothing. One of the searchers, a new volunteer, reported seeing someone standing deep in the trees far off trail. Too tall, limbs too long. They raised a hand as if in greeting, then vanished. No one followed that lead. Within weeks, a local initiative formed to close Cold Ridge indefinitely. The forest was deemed ecologically unstable, unsafe for further research. But the reports kept coming in. Faint outlines on trail cams, dreams of being buried upright in warm, damp soil, and a new species of lichen, thick, soft, pale green, now blooming in a perfect spiral at the center of the glacial field. The pattern of a fingerprint, or a spiral staircase, or something pulling itself slowly upward, year by year, toward the air, toward you. You made it back for now, but the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now, too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video, subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.